Good afternoon. It is my distinct honor to welcome you to this inaugural session of the expert panel, a flagship initiative of the Institute for Advanced Studies at the University Mohammed VI Polytechnic, or UM6P. And the topic of our expert panel today is precision medicine and precision One Health. Today, we bring together five really world-renowned experts from different countries, from actually 5 different countries, covering 3 different continents, that will actually cover a spectrum of our topic today, from pioneering genomic researcher and industrial leaders to policy architects of One Health champions. We have some carefully selected questions for this panel, and the session is designed to eliminate cutting-edge development, unpack emerging challenges, and catalyze actionable dialogue across the entire One Health continuum, with very special focus on human health outcomes worldwide. Now I will introduce the distinguished members of the panel one after the other. So we are privileged to be joined by Dr. Rajae Aouad. She's president of One Health Morocco and member of the WHO Scientific Advisory Committee, and she's also member of the Hassan II Academy for Science and Technology. Welcome, Rajae.
Thanks for the
And
invite.
from UK and also France jointly, Dr. Philippe Froguel, who is the chair in genomic medicine at Imperial College London, and also director of the genomic research University. Welcome, Philippe. And representing the United States, we are privileged to have Dr. Alan Shuldiner, who is the Vice President at Regeneron Research Center in the US. Welcome, Anna. And from the UK, we have Dr. Sonia Marjanovic, the Director of Healthcare Innovation at RAND Europe. Welcome, Sonia. And last but not least, Dr. José Luis Costa, who is the Global Director of Scientific Affairs, expert in clinical next generation sequencing and oncology at Thermo Scientific, based in Portugal. Welcome, José.
Thank you so much.
So together with this extraordinary panel covering research or bridging research, policy, history, and clinical practice, we look forward to a rich and transformative dialogue. Now, we will start addressing a set of questions to each one of the members of the panel, and as we cover all those aspects that I just mentioned. And we start with Rajae in Morocco. And let's dive into the topic of health equity and genomic medicine access. Obviously, the African, it's clear now, the African genome data remains really critically underrepresented in global databases, which limit, of course, the development of region-specific targets or drug targets and precision therapies. So as a member of the WHO Scientific Advisory Committee and advocate of health equity, what concrete mechanism can ensure equitable participation of African populations in global genomic research? It is really timely, while protecting against exploitable practices, of course. And the second question related to it, how can initiatives like the African CDC pathogen genomic surveillance framework correct this data imbalance?
Thank you. Thank you, Abdali, for this question. This is a fundamental issue for both scientific equity and global health security. The underrepresentation of African genomic data is not simply a scientific gap, it's a systematic imbalance that directly affects the effectiveness, the relevance, and
just a little bit the laptop as it covers the camera.
Okay. I was saying it is a systematic imbalance that directly affects the effectiveness, the relevance, and fairness of global health innovation. The first shift we need is conceptual, from participation to ownership. African population should not just be included in global research, they must help shape it. This requires moving from extractive models towards African-led or shared agenda, research agenda, decision-making power within collaboration, recognition of local institutions as equal partners. Second, the concrete mechanisms for equitable participation are first, strong data governance and sovereignty, which implies national and regional data governance policies, ethical frameworks for data sharing, clear rules on access, ownership, and use. In fact, clear frameworks are essential to ensure trust and prevent exploitation. Second, mandatory equitable partnership. Equity should be built into research design. This means shared leadership in projects, co-authorship and intellectual property rights, long-term institutional collaboration, not just short-term projects. Third, capacity building as a non-negotiable. Equitable participation is impossible without capacity. Priorities include currently genomic sequencing infrastructure, bioinformatic platforms, training of African scientists and data experts. Without capacity, participation remains symbolic. At fourth, fair benefit sharing. Participating must translate into tangible benefits. These include access to diagnosis and therapy, local innovation ecosystem, return of values to communities. The frameworks like the CDC, the Africa CDC pathogen surveillance strategy are game changers, and we are experiencing it. They can coordinate genomic effort across the continent, harmonize standards and data systems, strengthen regional hubs, and promote data sharing within Africa. Most importantly, they enable African ownership of genomic intelligence. So the key shift is that we must move from data extraction to data sovereignty and from inclusion to leadership. Because ultimately, genomic equity is not just a scientific issue, it's a matter of justice. I hope with this I have answered this first and fundamental question for the justice of genomic information.
Absolutely great. Thank you very much, Raja. It's a number of criteria, number of really requirement that needs to be taken into consideration, and it's, I believe, work in progress as we enhance the genomic research coverage throughout the whole continent of Africa, not just in few spots. Now, let me move to Philippe, and the topic in particular, the topic of course close to your heart and your expertise, from genomic discovery to clinical diabetes care. So you're a pioneer, actually, and your pioneer work identified glycokinase for the first type 2 diabetes gene, and subsequently after the receptor gene. So fundamentally reshaping our understanding of metabolic disease. Yet, genomic discovery or translating genomic discoveries to clinical practice remain somewhat limited or slow. What are the primary barriers, in your opinion, that prevent this routine genetic screening for monogenic diabetes in clinical setting? And my follow-up question linked to it, and what excuse me, and what evidence would be required to convince a health system to implement population-scale genomic screening for diabetes risk stratification?
So I think that in our field, which is cardiometabolic diseases, and it's exactly also what Alan is doing in dyslipidemia. We have made huge progress in the last 30 years. And we know that for these chronic disorders, there are some so-called monogenic form, and there is maybe 5–10% of the patient that are important to diagnose, because precision medicine can be proposed to this patient, because we found some actionable genes, mean that define a mutation one of the genes. There are some treatment, a specific treatment for them that improve the life of the patient and decrease the expenses, health expenses. That is quite important. And what is missing these days for diabetes, for instance, for familial dyslipidemia? We know that it exists, and we all know people who have a familial high cholesterol. And of course, if it's due to a mutation, and it's often due to mutation in a gene or a couple of genes, that the children may have this mutation. But the classic way is not to do anything to children, because pediatricians notice that when children are young, they have normal cholesterol. But unfortunately, the fact that they have apparent normal cholesterol is only due because they are growing organisms. And in fact, when they are 18, 20, they already have atherosclerosis. And there was a paper recently published in The Lancet saying that instead we should sequence the children, and we should take care of the children, even if apparently their cholesterol is normal, and there are ways to do it. So I think this example, and the same, we can have the same in diabetes, in obesity, in different fields, shows that what is important is to convince the doctors that there is interest or emergency to look for mutation, especially in families where there are this kind of early onset disorders, so genetic disorders. And it's why, for instance, the government of Mauritius have asked me to work on precision medicine. And the first thing I said is, okay, but I want to train doctors to genomic medicine, because if doctors are not convinced, even if we have the best genome center in the world, even if we can do that for very little money, which is the case now, there will be little demand, because the doctors don't really understand the theory. So we have to train the doctors. We have to help them when we find mutations, so frequent or rare mutation. We have to provide them with some argument to do something different, and which means that we have to bring them to some kind of prevention, primary, secondary, or tertiary prevention for comorbidities. So genetics found a lot, and the cost of sequencing decrease every day. And it's now really true that in the next 2 or 3 years, we have the sequence the genome for $100. Which means the difficulty is not there. The difficulty is to translate that to understandable knowledge for the doctors, that using this information will transform the life of their patient. In my field, which is cardiometabolic disorders, there was a revolution in treatment. Not only the GLP-1 receptor analog, but the SGLT2 inhibitors and new drugs that, including in the company from to Alan, they're against lipoprotein little a, different things, which mean that preventing complication of diabetes, for instance, decreasing of 50% the prevalence of end-stage renal disease is possible in the next years. And we can do it, but we have to work with the doctors.
Great, great. Thank you very much, Philippe. I'm going to move to Alan, but before asking question, I think Alan, you wanted perhaps to comment on the answers from Philippe.
Well, I think Philippe is right on. Science advances and we make new discoveries all the time in terms of understanding the genetic nature of all sorts of monogenic diseases. And where the gap exists is in the implementation. And I think educating clinicians about these scientific findings and how they can be translated to their patients in meaningful ways is a huge barrier.
Absolutely. And shall I also say congratulations? I believe Regeneron just got about probably a couple of weeks ago or 2-3 weeks ago, we FDA approval for the first gene therapy for, I believe, the hearing loss. Is that correct?
Yes,
that's
correct.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
The field is moving. So my question to you, Alan, and this is in the area of drug target discovery at Regeneron Regenetics Center. So the center has sequenced hundreds and thousands of exomes, identifying human genetic variant that protect against or predispose to disease. So your discovery of the ApoC3 null mutation, which advanced ApoC3 and novel therapeutic targets, exemplifies this experiment of nature approach to drug discovery. The question is, what are the most promising new genetic targets currently emerging at your center? The large-scale sequencing effort for cardiovascular disease, and how has the integration of AI and machine learning accelerated target identification and validation?
Well, thank you for that question. So many in the audience may not be familiar with the ApoC3 story. I can summarize it quickly. These were studies that were done back around 2008, in which we were very interested in understanding the genetic architecture of lipid disorders in the Old Water Amish from Pennsylvania. And in the Amish, it turns out that we found a mutation in ApoC3 gene that actually is associated with low triglyceride levels and protection from heart disease. And the reason we were able to discover this in the Amish, where no one else had been able to discover this in other populations, is that the Amish are a founder population. And through genetic through a founder effect and genetic drift, this particular mutation became very frequent in the Amish population and therefore much more easily discoverable. And I think that in many ways that discovery and others at the time kicked off interest in the pharma industry to begin to apply human genetics to become more efficient in discovering new targets for therapy. And so multiple pharma companies, Regeneron included, developed genetics programs in-house. Fast forwarding, the genetics program at the Regeneron Genetics Center is really the hallmark of all new target discoveries across the company. We've now done exome sequencing of over 3 million people from all over the world in collaboration with more than 150 academic collaborators and healthcare system collaborators throughout the world. And with that information, genetic information, coupled to electronic health record data, all de-identified, we can essentially cast our net across the entire genome and the entire clinical phenome to find new genetic variants that protect from disease. And this is a very simple concept. If a a person has a genetic variant that results in a loss of function of that variant, and that individual is protected from a particular disease, it suggests that if we could mimic that loss of function pharmacologically, we can have a new therapeutic for that disease. And this has been very successful at Regeneron, and we've now discovered a number of new genetic targets that we're pursuing in a big way. Specifically, we're very interested in metabolic dysfunction associated steatohepatitis, so-called MASH. And we have two pharma programs, HSD17B13 inhibition, and also a new gene called SIDEB that genetically we have identified as some genes that would be very good targets to inhibit in order to protect or treat steatohepatitis. In the obesity arena, yes, the GLP drugs are quite effective, but other genes and pathways, maybe as or more effective. And a gene called GPR75 is one that we've discovered from a genetic perspective, protects from obesity, and now programs to inhibit GPR75 are in place. I can go on and on here about otoferin, the gene that was mentioned, a new gene therapy for deafness and hearing loss, Ebola, cancer, neurodegenerative diseases, etc., all starting with genetic discoveries.
I see. Great. Thank you very much, Alan. So we're actually moving, starting with from One Health leadership to academic research, to industry and genomics, and now to policy and innovation with Sonia. Sonia, let's focus on the policy framework for precision medicine adoption. And your research at Trend Europe focuses on the interface between health innovation and system improvement, with the precision medicine market projected to reach now over 530 billion by 2025, and now with the AI and precision medicine growing to a rate of over 25% accumulated growth rate, what policy frameworks are most effective for accelerating the adoption of both more personalized and more precise medicine in healthcare? And a follow-up question, drawing from your own work with key decision makers in the UK and overall in Europe, more widely the NHS, England, and the European Commission, what type of policy and regulatory actions and considerations are important in enabling precision and personalized medicine integration, as well as wider treatment innovations? Quite a long question.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Abdulali. There's a lot to unpack in that question, and I wish I had a magic bullet I don't solution, but I'll take it in turn. I think before I answer, it's important to say, just as context, that of course all of this matters beyond just industry and markets, and that innovation, as previous panelists have said, in so many areas is really bringing transformative benefits for patients and population health and the quality and efficiency of healthcare services. So I think it's really important when we talk about policy in this area to look at it not just from industrial strategy, which is very important, but it's to serve the purpose of healthcare improvement and healthcare services and population health. So both the current impact and the future potential of innovation in precision medicine is enormous, and not only in precision medicine. We see genomic medicine tests and treatments for cancers and rare diseases. We see novel immunotherapies, cell therapies for cancer, but not everything has to be high tech. We also see much simpler digital health solutions for monitoring patients with hypertension or virtual and online mental health therapies. So innovation is a very, very broad topic. But bringing it back to your question, there are several things that really matter for appropriate policy and for creating innovation-friendly health systems more broadly. And, I could spend a whole hour on this, but I won't, don't worry. I'll zoom into some key themes to do with finance, with regulation, with data access and use, and with the workforce, but keeping the patient front and center of what we're thinking about. So I will start with funding, because funding is the absolutely necessary condition for progress in the area, even though it's absolutely not the sufficient condition on its own. But we have to have clear and appropriate policy around the financing of research and innovation. So if we look at research and development, so the supply side and the stimulus for research and development, this has to have public funding to seed and feed the research and innovation pipelines for precision medicine, to support the infrastructure, to support public-private collaborations. But we also need fundings from private equity, venture capital, and industry. And this is not only important for developing novel precision medicine, diagnostics, treatments, but also for driving jobs and economic growth. But governments also need to focus much more on better, strategic signaling of demand and better prioritization of investments, so that they can align the supply of what is coming through with areas of demand and willingness to pay. And, in genomics and in genomics medicine, that funding has to be in place to roll out genomic medicine services and to translate all these advances into impact. Then if we look at the adoption of innovation and the integration into healthcare services and funding for that, that also has to be prioritized. And I think it's really important to think about how one navigates price negotiations and procurement, especially in the current geopolitical climate. And on the topic of purchasing, I think something that's really interesting to think about is, what has to be done at a country level? What's the Europe and member state issue, for example, and what can be coordinated through more kind of regional or even global policies and procurement mechanisms. We saw that during COVID. At the moment in Europe, there's joint procurement being looked at in terms of critical medicines in the context of supply chain resilience. And also for many types of innovation, it takes time to realize returns on investments. So nobody can really expect immediate reform and immediate cash savings and benefits. The other thing on funding, before I move on to other themes that I think is really important, is to think about the clinical trials landscape, because clinical trials can be a source of both revenue for healthcare systems and a source of early access to treatments for patients. And improving that clinical trials capacity also calls for good regulation and governance, so that's not too bureaucratic, so that trials can begin in a timely way, and a good focus on patient recruitment and buy-in and honest conversations around this. I want to come back to this. This is complex. A genuinely informed and engaged public is essential for clinical trials. Otherwise, there can be misinformation, and some of it is due to historical practices, but there could be fears of exploitation. On your point about regulation, there I think it's key to emphasize that clearer and efficient regulation of how approval processes work, or how even trials are set up, so as little bureaucracy as possible, is very important for those who are pioneering research and development of diagnostics and treatments and other sorts of therapies. But also regulation that is compatible and aligned with different parts of the globe. Because when, especially smaller companies, when they have to navigate different rules in different countries and different regions, it's very costly and it's very time consuming. And if regulation is too cumbersome and if the market's not big enough, then they won't bother. Another key pillar for progress from a policy framework kind of lens is improving access to and use and sharing of data and information and evidence, supported by interoperability and public trust in data sharing. I think we're seeing masses and masses of improvement in our capacity to generate data. I'm sure we'll get into AI later. And then that goes beyond genomics data. It's about linking genomics data with behavioral and lifestyle data and data from electronic clinical records. But to do this, one really has to have public trust. And that can't be secured just through technology. Of course, technology can go a long way in ensuring data privacy and security, or you can have, good data standards and regulation. But one has to have effective public engagement that is sensitive to the culture and the context of the patients and populations one's dealing with. And so what works in the UK may or may not work in Morocco. But I think we need to be really clear on, benefits for patients, transparency on risk, clarity on safeguards, And this has to be done by trusted institutions. And sometimes that's governments and sometimes it's not. And then finally, I want to pick up, we started with training of the workforce, which both Philippe and Alan commented on. I think this is a key issue. And I think really what's important here is thinking about the education and the upskilling and the incentives and the accountabilities to engage with innovation for the healthcare workforce through time, through permission, through job structures, through career pathways. But not everyone working in healthcare needs to be an innovator. The issue is that more people need to really understand what innovation is about in order to promote a culture of best practice. And for this, we need to reform training and education curricula. So our medics, our scientists, are not just people in business schools, but the people exposed to innovation and what it's all about early on in their careers. And then just one or two more points on this question. I think science and technology are evolving and they're changing so rapidly. And if we look at the developments with AI, if we also look at just how blurred the boundaries are between different disciplines, now it's really all about the interface of genomics and AI and quantum in the future computing. Everything's changing so rapidly. So we can't just assume that someone's going to go to med school or, do a science degree and they'll finish their training or PhD or postdoc and that's all done. We need to kind of build training platforms that are about continual upskilling and continual professional development so people can keep up with the times. And I think there's a lot to be said around collaborative approaches to training pipelines. So be that formal and on the job learning, both actually, and close connections, fluid labor markets between industry, between research institutes and universities, between health services. So I think these are some of the issues that really matter for every area of innovation and of course, precision medicine very much. So I think I'll stop there. I could say a lot more, but I'm conscious.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Sonia. You're absolutely right. I mean, every single aspect or consideration from what you have just said deserve perhaps one session by itself. But I'm glad at least we cover perhaps maybe the top list of those as much as we can for the allocated time of this program.
Absolutely.
Now let's go back now to the industry leadership and now with José. And dive into the area of companion diagnostics and real-time therapy matching. So pan-cancer companion diagnostics are expanding label-indicated drug markets globally. Yet, reimbursement and regulatory harmonization remain inconsistent across jurisdictions. With your experience in NGS solutions and navigating the global approvals, whether it's FDA, EMEA, and global regulatory pathways, what regulatory reforms are needed to enable faster approval and broader reimbursement of companion diagnostics tests? That's one. Two, how can the integration of genomic profiling into electronic health records enable real-time matching of patients to approved targeted therapies, clinical trials, and emerging treatments?
Thank you once again for the invitation to be here, and thank you very much for the strong question already at the beginning. So I'll try to answer this from a perspective of someone that is working in the interface between the diagnostic development, regulatory science, medical affairs, and global implementation. In precision oncology, there's been a trend on the right drug still needs the right test. That's no doubt. But I think this statement is evolving with time. And now I would actually add that it's not just the right test at the right time, but it really requires the right clinical workflow and accessibility to the right patient population. So I think it's becoming more and more complex what needs to be achieved. We know, of course, that companion diagnostics have become essentially enablers of precision oncology. But what has not evolved at the same time is the surrounding ecosystem where this takes place. We do still see a global fragmentation across regulatory pathways, reimbursement models, the evidences that are actually required for the different approvals, and also the timing that the drugs and the diagnostics are actually approved in the different regions. And this leads to actually to a kind of a paradox where science can actually clearly identify which patients are likely to benefit from the drug. However, the access to the necessary test remains inconsistent and in many cases actually delayed. So a little bit having this in the back of the mind, I would think or suggest that maybe 3 reforms are particularly important. One is on bringing a more harmonized and predictable pathway for the development of the drugs, but also the diagnostic test. That is, to have very early in the process of any drug that is being developed, to include already what is the diagnostic strategy, so that it doesn't just become an afterthought late in the process of the drug development. Because there are many things that could be defined very early in the process, like what is the definition of the biomarker, what is the sample that is required to do that test, analytical validation, clinical validation, all the post-approval studies that are required to support the implementation. So this will very early in the process bring together the regulators, the pharmaceutical sponsors, and of course the diagnostic developers to work together and make this a much more productive and efficient process. Second that I could think of is on regulatory frameworks to better support comprehensive genomic profiling. And why is this? Because in the past we had an older model, which is of one drug, one biomarker, one test. I think this is no longer really the reality. With more drugs coming with the tumor and cancer indications, with drugs coming for tumor agnostic therapies, now we have resistance mutations, we have different biomarkers like gene fusions, copy number changes, and even complex signatures. This really brings the requirement for a broader NGS approach. And what we need are clearly pathways for how to update panels, how to update with new claims, and how to make this simpler by just probably bringing bridging studies so that all the entire process makes it a bit much quicker and efficient for patients in particular. Third, I think reimbursement. So reimbursement must evolve from just seeing a diagnostic test as a cost, but also to really recognize it as an enabler of a therapeutic value. So meaning that if a genomic test can really avoid ineffective therapies, this will accelerate the access to the right treatment. It might identify better clinical trial options for the patients, and this doesn't just bring value to the patient, but to the entire healthcare ecosystem. So this needs to be taken in consideration when reimbursement schemes are actually taking into or considering the costs involved into this. On your question on electronic health records integration, I think we need to move away from having a genomic profile that it's a fixed PDF report outside of the entire clinical workflow. So the results need to be structured. There have to be specific guidelines on how this should be structured and what information should be contained into them. They need to be searchable. They need to be interoperable and linked also to clinical decision platforms, so that the clinician should be able to see whether a patient's molecular profile matches or not an approved therapy. And this needs to be within a very hectic and very stressed activity that the clinicians have. So it needs to be in a simplified way to identify and to make sense of what information is there. Of course, all this requires a governance. So we need curated knowledge databases. We need to have in place privacy safeguards. We need to have clear responsibility for interpretation of the genomic information that is there, and of course the tools to make it usable for the busy clinicians. So in the end, I don't think that the future is just simply generating more and more genomic data. It's very important that that data is making, actionability to the point of care. So making it accessible at point of care to be informed on clinical decisions.
Absolutely.